Thank you so much for inviting us on the program. This work is joint with Michael Ewens, who's here, and Sabrina Howell, my colleague at NYU. The motivation for our project is a large shift in ownership that we've seen in the newspaper industry. So historically, newspapers and many other media properties were owned by families or other private investors that balanced profit-making with other competing objectives. More recently, we've seen the large entry of private equity investors into this space, and this growth has sparked a lot of concerns that these investors, who have really high-power profit incentives, are going to alter the supply function of information. And so there's been a lot of debate about whether these types of investors might degrade the capacity for newspapers and for the media more broadly to provide the essential governance function that we need in a democracy. At the same time, we know that this is a declining industry, and private equity investors argue that they, in fact, bring valuable capital and technological expertise that can help stabilize this industry. Here, for example, is Civitas Media, one of the large private equity investors that we study. And they argue that under the leadership of the CEO, this company was able to achieve significant cost synergies by successfully streamlining operations, launching new online and mobile platforms, and introducing new creative revenue initiatives. So there's a debate here, or thinking about how do private equity investors actually impact newspaper operations. So that's going to be a key research question. How has the entry of these investors impacted newspaper operations, local news coverage, and other community outcomes? We think this is an essential question to study, given the central importance of information in our democracy and the essential role that the supply side of information plays in fulfilling a governance role in our society. To study this question, we're going to put together really comprehensive novel data that's going to combine information on all daily newspapers in the country, along with really comprehensive information about their circulation, their ownership, the textual content of newspapers, employment, and other local community outcomes, stretching a period of about 20 years. So let me say two things about our setting. The first is that our context is sort of comparable to concrete or cement, which are two widely studied industries in I/O, in the sense that the country is geographically partitioned into different media markets which have limited spillovers into other areas, allowing us to understand the impact of these ownership shifts on these local, spatially disaggregated outcomes. And also, that our setting is really unique because we really think we have a complete census of every firm in our setting. We think we have really all newspapers in the country, whether they're private or public. That allows us to make much more comprehensive statements that typically people rely on international data for. And we're able to combine kind of in one data set the product, which is a newspaper, the sales, the employment, as well as these broader spillover impacts on local communities. So this kind of provides us a very nice setting to understand the role of these ownership shifts. Our empirical strategy is going to be a difference in difference framework in which we're using the fact that private equity ownership has really increased from about 5% to close to a quarter of all newspapers by the end of our sample. And what do we find? First, we see digital circulation actually increases pretty substantially by about 44%. So that's actually consistent with the argument that the private equity investors are making, that they're bringing in new technological investment that is improving the capacity of newspapers to reach a broader audience. We also find that newspaper survival goes up. This is, again, a really important outcome in the context of this otherwise declining industry. On the negative side, we find that employment declines substantially, and this is particularly true of reporters who are out there doing investigative journalism, as well as of editors. So this suggests that the capacity for newspapers to provide independent, idiosyncratic local news content might be adversely affected. And consistent with that, we find that local news content does decline substantially, while national news content goes up. So the way we understand these findings is in context of the fact that providing idiosyncratic local news content is expensive and does not scale very easily. You need to have reporters all around the country in order to report on local news issues. It's much easier to have one person report on what's going on in DC and cross-syndicate this content across all the newspapers under the control of a private equity investor. So this type of consolidation is able to achieve cost reductions and increase profits, but comes at the cost of a more homogeneous news environment. We care less about what's happening in our own backyards, and we're more outraged about what's happening in DC today. So when we look at the broader civic engagement consequences of private equity takeovers, we find that local political awareness and turnout in local elections goes down. So the overall takeaway from our project is that private equity ownership in newspapers comes with important trade-offs. On the positive side, we have that the investments in digital media, the improvements in survival rates, might extend the survival of newspapers as a platform. But the costs include lowering this provision of idiosyncratic, local, distinctive news content, which has consequences for local civic engagement. Okay, let me first start by talking about our data. Again, I think we put together really interesting, comprehensive data for the course of this project. We hope to make much of it available publicly for other researchers who want to study the newspaper industry. So what we start with is these physical editor and publisher books that look something like this. And so these are physical books that we have scanned and digitized. And what these books contain is a complete census of every daily newspaper in the country. They were originally marketed for advertising companies who need to understand what newspapers are there in the country and their local attributes so they can decide advertising. And consequently, they have a lot of really detailed information about these newspapers that includes, of course, their name, the circulation, as well as the owner who actually owns each of these newspapers, and a variety of other information, the circulation, that we all scrape from these physical books for a period of 20 years. So this allows us to understand attributes of every single daily newspaper in the country, its ownership, and other attributes about the newspaper. So that's kind of the skeleton base of our project that provides us with information of about 1,600 daily newspapers. We combine that information with more data on circulation, particularly on digital circulation. We've done a lot of careful looking in this ownership field, and we think we have a really good sense of the ownership of all these newspapers across this whole sample, particularly around the timing of private equity deals. So we have a really good sense of when these newspapers transition to private equity control. We then combine this information with textual content of the newspapers for a little bit less than half of our sample, and we classify that text into local and national news. We also get employment information from LinkedIn. So this allows us to look at reporters and editors' employment histories at these local newspapers. So if you have a history of working for a particular newspaper or not, we'll see that on your LinkedIn profile, and we're thereby able to match employment records for newspapers to understand employment counts before and after these private equity takeovers. And then finally, we have other local political information drawn from surveys and turnout data that allow us to look at these broader community impacts of private equity takeovers. So overall, I think we have a nice contribution here in kind of combining in one data set really all the different attributes of the firm, from the product side, the newspaper, the sales revenue side, the production function, including the reporters that are producing the news, and then finally the broader spillover consequences on local communities. So we're able to look at the ownership here for newspapers across our sample. So we have the ownership categorized into different types of owners. These include families, independents, publicly owned companies, private chains, and so forth. Our key focus is going to be on the rise of private equity investors, shown at the bottom, that have grown in importance substantially over the course of our sample period. Here we're just showing the private equity investors specifically. And so they've really increased their investments in these newspapers. Most recently, Gatehouse Media, one of the largest private equity owners in our sample, acquired Gannett, a very large newspaper company. And so now we kind of have a very substantial private equity ownership stake in newspapers all across the country. Okay, I'm going to talk next about the empirical strategy we're going to use to disentangle the effects of private equity takeovers. We're going to start with a relatively straightforward difference in difference approach, in which the key idea is going to be to control for year fixed effects and newspaper fixed effects, so invariant characteristics to the time period of the local newspaper, and look at the consequences for a variety of outcome measures before and after the private equity takeover. Those outcome measures are going to include circulation, local news content, employment, survival. The key assumption we're going to make under our approach is that the timing of the deal, when precisely the deal closed, is assumed to be conditionally exogenous, conditional on all the other controls that we have. I can talk more maybe in the Q&A about selection and the other things that we've done to kind of look into endogeneity. Okay, let's move on to the results. So here's our first key finding. we look at the impact of private equity takeovers on digital circulation, and we find that private equity investors lead to a 44% increase in digital circulation in the newspapers that they take over. So this increase in digital circulation is matched by, if anything, decreases in the other categories of circulation. So part of this reflects maybe a switching over of people from print to digital platforms. But it suggests that the investors are putting into place various investments that increase the digital reach of these newspapers and allow them to access a broader base, right? So it's consistent with the idea that private equity investors have some superior technical know-how or skill, at least relative to the existing set of owners, which enable them to make these important investments that expand the capacities of newspapers. So that's an important plus side for what private equity investors are able to do. We also find the private equity investors raise the survival rates of these newspapers as well. So we define survival as reflecting newspapers that don't have a closure event, which consists of one of these three different outcomes, whether you shut down, whether you merge, have a new name, or whether you transition into a weekly newspaper, right? Thinking of weekly newspapers as those that provide much less local news content than those that are provided daily. So private equity-owned newspapers are much less likely to have these negative outcomes, right? So they're less likely to close, less likely to transition into weeklies. And so this is another powerful positive impact of private equity investors in expanding the survival rates, expanding the duration of these newspaper companies. Again, in the context of this otherwise declining industry, this is a really important stabilizing effect that private equity investors are bringing to the table. However, on the negative side, we find more adverse consequences for employment. So to look at employment, we're doing an event study here where we're looking at the number of journalists employed in the newspaper as judged on LinkedIn, right? So we're looking from the LinkedIn profiles of everyone on LinkedIn, and we're looking at whether these individuals are employed at the newspaper in question, and we're looking at the timing of that employment judged by the history that they report on LinkedIn. And we ask whether this reporter or editor or employee of this newspaper is still employed, looking at different years around the timing of when this private equity acquisition of a newspaper took place. Before the timing of the deal, we don't really observe any significant pre-trends. After the timing of the deal takes place, we then observe a substantial decrease in the employment rates at these newspapers. That's consistent with the idea that they're taking over the company and firing a bunch of the people that work there. So we see about an 8% decline in employees about year 3 or so after the takeover. So then we turn to looking at other consequences that this employment shock might have on the operations of this newspaper. And we're going to look at local news content. So the reason local news is important is that this is how individuals form information about what's happening in their own local communities. So to measure this, we take the textual content of newspapers and classify these on the basis of keywords into items that we think are going to be more likely to represent local news content. So specifically, we're looking at a lot of keywords that relate to governance, school, and obituaries that are happening in local news. Most recently with COVID, what's going on with local school policies is, of course, a very important issue on which individuals need to be informed about in their local areas. And so these keywords allow us then to understand the composition of news and how much of it reflects local content, what's distinctive in your community, as opposed to what's happening nationally. And we see a decrease in local news content that's happening in the aftermath of private equity buyouts that's matched by an increase in national news content. So by national news, we mean things like Bush, Congress, Trump, Obama, et cetera, right? We're talking about the kind of the keywords that relate to how people are outraged about the national news environment in contrast to what's going on in your own local community. And we think of this trade-over, the fact that these private equity investors are lowering the local news content but raising the national content in conjunction with the employment results, as suggesting a cost-cutting strategy that private equity investors are able to adopt in the portfolio companies that they control. And the key intuition for this result is that local news production is costly and doesn't scale. It's very hard to produce information about all these distinctive communities because you need separate reporters and on-the-ground reporting in all these different areas. It's much cheaper and easier to have one person reporting on what's going on in the White House and cross-syndicate this content, take the same article and report it in all of the newspapers under your control, and provide readers with this content instead. So this is just showing the results in regression format here. So we see the deterioration of local news content. That's the first column. So those go down about 10% of the mean relative to the increase that we observe for national news content. So again, just a shifting in the composition of news that local newspapers are reporting away from that local news more towards national news content. So next, we turn to looking at broader spillover consequences of this takeover activity on local political outcomes. And to look at that, we're using here a survey, the Cooperative Congressional Election Survey, that asks people what their opinion is about a variety of political figures. So these include the president, the governor, and the senator. So most people have a pretty good sense of who the president is or have an opinion on them. People have less information about their local House representative, and we find that in counties that have private equity takeovers, those counties report a greater increase in the fraction of people that have no opinion about who their House representative is, while there's no impact on people's impressions about their senator, the governor, or the president. There's a slight decrease in the fraction of people that have a high news interest. So our interpretation of this result is that people rely on local news in order to provide them with information, particularly on their most local representatives, rather than, whereas they're able to get information on these more broader national figures from national media. And so this trade over from local news towards national news means that people are therefore less informed about their most local representatives while they're saturated information already about their national elected officials. So you see this large increase in no opinion of local representatives here. We also look at turnout and other election-related information. So here we're capturing individuals turning out for local county council races. So these are kind of a very local political body that people rely on local newspaper reporting to understand the coverage of individuals responsible. We're also looking at mayoral races here. And what we kind of find is that the turnout in these very local, hyper-local races tends to go down when we look at counties that have private equity takeovers. So kind of consistent with the idea that local news coverage is important for people's engagement with these very local races, we find that turnout in these races is declining in the aftermath of private equity buyout. I should say these results are also kind of consistent with a variety of other data that political scientists have found. So in particular, people have observed that there's much more partisanship in how people vote. So previously, people would distinguish a lot more between candidates, and now it's much more likely that people vote straight ticket party lines, Republican or Democrat, across all officials, whether they're local or national. That trend is driven by a variety of factors. We think one contributing part of that factor can be the increasingly national news diet that people are exposed to. So you have less information about distinctive local candidates, and you're more saturated in news about national politics. Okay, so one important thing in the background here is the role of the internet, because that's kind of been one of the key driving forces that's been affecting the viability of the industry overall. Our discussant, for example, has a really nice paper looking at the introduction of Craigslist. So newspapers are a two-party platform that caters on the one hand to readers and on the other hand to advertisers. And the introduction of Craigslist disrupted this platform by introducing a new marketplace in which individuals can advertise and trade. And so our discussant finds that that already had a large impact on newspapers, and the internet didn't stop there. It's kind of continuing to have a large impact on the way news is provided. So the way we think about that in our setting is we're kind of really using that context to try to understand how does private equity operate in the context of declining industry? How is value generated in this declining industry? And we do find that private equity investors are able to kind of stabilize a little bit the survival rates of newspapers in the industry, but at the cost of other spillover consequences on local understanding of political issues. And by looking at those political outcomes, we're also sort of implicitly testing for whether alternate social media can substitute for the information provided by local newspapers. So if people were equally informed by social media as they were by newspapers, we wouldn't expect to see an impact on awareness of political figures or of turnout outcomes, but the fact that those decline seems to suggest that social media is not a complete substitute for the reporting that local media provides. We also look at a lot of other tests in the paper. Happy to come back to any of these things in the Q&A. All right, we contribute to a variety of literatures here. So the first of these is the role of media in politics. A lot of papers have studied the role, the governance role that news media provides in the context of democracies. So we're kind of contributing to this debate by highlighting an important supply-side force of private equity investors, which we think impact news content and therefore political outcomes. We're also kind of implicitly engaging with this broader debate on social media by looking at how the trade-over and the shift in traditional news sources can be potentially substitutable by social media by looking at those political outcomes. And then finally, we're in this broader private equity literature, which has looked at a variety of different consequences of private equity takeovers, including work by Constantine, who's here. And we're contributing this literature by sort of emphasizing, again, that the private equity in the context of this industry has unique consequences, particularly on stakeholders that aren't necessarily directly affected by newspapers, but are the broader citizens who are engaged in the local community. Okay, so to wrap up the paper, we argue that there are important trade-offs associated with the impact of private equity investors in the newspaper space. On the positive side, we observe an increase in digital subscriptions and an increase in survival rates, and both of these are really important for how to understand declining industries' ability to adapt to new digital technologies. But on the downside, we argue that the cost savings and consolidation measures that private equity firms use in order to make profits in this industry result in layoffs of these journalists and appear to adversely impact local news content. This shock to local news content, therefore, spills over into local political knowledge and engagement, and kind of stems from the fact that this national news content is more scalable than local news content. Thank you very much, and look forward to comments from our discussant.